Hello and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I'm very glad to be here with you. Over the last couple of years, what was once called the UFO community has seen a huge shift, not only in the attention given to the phenomenon of UFOs itself, but that's been quite remarkable all by itself. But I think something that has not been fully expected is that we have also seen a transformation in the very language that is used to describe this phenomenon. Now, the evolution of language surrounding this phenomenon, once called flying saucers in the early days, then to unidentified aerial phenomena. Well, that's what we've come to unidentified flying objects, to unidentified aerial phenomena, then to unidentified anomalous phenomena. This is a journey of language that in many ways mirrors a society that is trying, on the one hand, to understand this, whatever this thing is, and also deal with the mechanics of government secrecy. So we go with this transition from flying saucers to UFO, now to UAP, as well as a transition from disclosure to transparency. I'm going to be talking about all of this. And I would suggest to you that this is something, whether you like the new terminology or have trouble with the new terminology, it is absolutely something that you want to be paying attention to it. The term flying saucers, back with its connotations in the 1940s and 50s, all these connotations of science fiction, hysteria, that gave way to something a little more sanitized, unidentified flying objects, UFO. And that was done by the United States military. The government itself created that acronym, that phrase. And it was an attempt, you could see, to give a kind of veneer of scientific objectivity, bureaucratic stability to the study of these phenomena. But I will suggest to you, along with the legendary comedian George Carlin, who used to talk about soft language, I will suggest that, again, there are things that we really want to be paying very close attention to. If you remember Carlin's bit on this, I think he did this back in the 90s, he talked about how language typically would evolve in starting with the most visceral, identifiable, clear language, and then over time becoming less and less real to us. So he used an example from the First World War, the phenomenon known as shell shock. This is when, soldiers would just be absolutely incapacitated psychologically due to the incredible artillery barrages of that war, which were legendary and infamous for just how destructive they were, not just physically, but to your mind. So it's called shell shock. And as Carlin pointed out, that was a very, that's straightforward, tells you what it is, exactly what that is. World War II, he says, well, the language changed to battle fatigue. Still pretty straightforward, but a little less graphic. He said during the Korean War, we started hearing the phrase operational exhaustion. I don't really know if I actually heard that one, but Carlin said he found it. Let's take him at his word. And then during Vietnam War, we get post-traumatic stress disorder, the most highly clinical and you could say detached type of language that you could use. He used a lot of other examples. I remember his really good one. He said toilet paper becoming bathroom tissue. He talked about job titles like janitor to custodian. Garbage man becomes a sanitation engineer. What was the other one? Secretary becomes an administrative assistant. Prisons become correctional facilities. It's really true. Blind becomes visually impaired, and on and on and on. And Carlin's critique of soft language really centered around the idea that these euphemisms and these indirect terms dilute the truth and make serious issues seem less immediate and less real. I think that's really the key. He believed that this type of language, and this was a theme that he hit really throughout his entire career, I would say, but that this type of language, that soft language, as he called it, obscures reality and diminishes the urgency, perhaps, of addressing important issues. And it creates, contributes to a culture of complacency, culture of denial, and the like. Is that really true? Maybe it is true. Within the UFO field, we have our own. 1940s and 50s, we had flying saucer, as I said. 1960s up to the 2010s, we had unidentified flying object, UFO. And then we go to unidentified anomalous phenomena. For a while, it was unidentified aerial phenomena. It keeps changing. And then we also go from disclosure to transparency. Again, we're going to get into all of those things. By the way, the phrase UAP, I think it might have been invented by this man, Dr. Richard Haynes, who is still with us, a really wonderful, excellent UFO researcher, and just a generally wonderful man. Haynes was a NASA scientist, a very active UFO researcher who wrote some very good books, founded the National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena, that's called NARCAP, back in 1999. NARCAP still has a very important role to play relating to this phenomenon, in my opinion. But I think it was Haynes. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've tried looking into this. I think he may have coined it. He definitely helped to popularize the term UAP, at least in the 90s. I'm thinking perhaps even as early as the 1980s. And his goal with this was to provide a more scientific framework for studying this phenomenon without all the cultural baggage that was associated with UFOs. I mean, understandable. I mean, a lot of that cultural baggage, of course, came as a direct result of United States intelligence community and national security community working directly with major media, with academia, with political institutions to discredit that whole concept, the whole concept of flying saucers and UFOs. We all know about the infamous Robertson panel of early 1953, which was a CIA, classified CIA organized scientific panel to deal with this whole problem of flying saucers / UFOs and how to essentially disable it in the public mind. That was the entire purpose of it, as we now know in retrospect. And in fact, we know that that panel recommended not only managing the media messaging on UFOs to debunk it and to demystify it and all of that. We know that they did that all behind the scenes. But they also recommended monitoring various UFO organizations back in 1953. And in fact, it looks like they probably did do that. That's a whole other story. But the point is that the phrase UFO, the concept of UFOs and flying saucers, were utterly trivialized by our culture for the longest time. And of course, if you were a serious person back in that time period wanting to study this phenomenon that had some genuinely interesting elements about it and some seemingly powerful testimony, and also once we got documents through Freedom of Information, some very, very damning government documents that proved U.S. government interest in this phenomenon. If you were one of those people, you'd think, well, I would like to study this, but the stigma of dealing with it is basically career ending. And it has always been that bad. That I've always argued was by design. But it's a funny thing about culture. Culture can be bottom up and it can also be top down. It works both ways. And when you have a very powerful set of institutions that have a certain interest in pushing a certain agenda, they will use propaganda to do that. They will absolutely do everything possible to influence that culture to the maximum extent they can, and very frequently are quite successful. The ridicule of UFOs is only one such example, but this is an old story. In any case, the phrase UAP, I believe coined by Dr. Haynes, was his attempt, one of many different types of attempts to rebrand this phenomenon so that so that serious people who had status in society would be less afraid of losing that status by looking at this subject. And that's understandable. And so that's what we really see. That was Haynes's goal, and you can't really argue with that. Now, the problem with that, as we will see, is that the phrase UAP can be used in a variety of ways. It can invite people in, but it can also thereby change what it actually means, and to an extent that's not particularly helpful. Let me pull up my next slide here. So going from UFO to UAP, a couple of things that it did. We really start seeing this happen around 2018, 2019, and 2020. It's really not that long ago. Even in 2017, for the most part, I think in the New York Times article in December of 2017, UFO was certainly used, but I think aerial phenomena was also a phrase that was in one of those articles. But the phrase UAP didn't really start getting used, as far as I can see, correct me if I'm wrong here, but till around 2020 or so, around the time that we started getting the UAP task force. Probably a little bit earlier than that. In fact, back in the days of the OSAP and ATIP programs, 2007, 2008, 2009, it was indicated to me that the individuals involved in that did want to use the phrase UAP, and I think probably did also in the spirit that Dr. Richard Haynes had initiated, that is to sort of open up and to destigmatize the topic. So going to UAP does do that to a large extent. It does destigmatize the subject of anomalous objects seen in the sky or in space or in the oceans. And it can broaden the scientific and the government discussion of this. You bring in more people in, they're less afraid. It has clearly, demonstrably shown that it going with UAP can bring you bipartisan congressional support without anyone jumping to conclusions, without anyone feeling like they're putting their career on the line necessarily. One person described it as a bit of giving us some legislative ambiguity. That's a double-edged sword. It's like you're going to create laws based on UAP. What exactly are we talking about? And there is the problem. UFO, technically speaking, is an unidentified flying object, and lots of people throughout the years love to point that out. But in reality, in the culture, in our ordinary understanding of it, most people are going to tell you UFO equals an alien craft. I mean, that's just how it is. That is how we've come to understand it. When we go back to UAP, it broadens that. So it includes a whole bunch of other things, including what the military likes to call TNOs, or temporarily non-attributable objects. Basically, any kind of junk that's up in the sky that is not immediately identified can be a TNO. And what you see is that starting with the UAP task force and within all of the arguments and discussions that took place, not only within that, but within its successor organizations throughout the Pentagon, in Congress, not everyone has the same idea as to what they think of when they hear UAP. It is not the same thing. UFO is one thing. UAP brings in a much larger group of people and a much larger conversation, and can complicate your objectives or your priorities because all depending on what you think this phenomenon really is. And in my observation, this is just me, but I don't think I'm the only one, the phrase UAP has tended to erase the alien aspect of this phenomenon from our public discussion. It's siphoned out the objects in favor of phenomena. It's siphoned out craft in favor of some vague whatever, air trash or some ball lightning or whatever, any kind of an absolutely clearly indicated object that the U.S. government feels that it can identify. So listen to this statement from a couple of years ago by Ronald Moultrie, who is Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, a very, very key, important role within the UAP task force and subsequent organizations following that. Moultrie, of course, was speaking to a congressional committee on this a couple of years ago, along with Scott Bray, and I'm going to read you this quote. He says, put simply, UAP are airborne objects that, when encountered, cannot be immediately identified. However, it is the department's contention that by combining appropriately structured collected data with rigorous scientific analysis, any object that we encounter can likely be isolated, characterized, identified, and, if necessary, mitigated. I'll never forget that statement. He says mitigated, and when you look over the whole history of U.S. military encounters with UFOs, I'm saying UFOs here, they're not doing a whole lot of mitigation of those things. I can absolutely tell you that quite confidently. There have been hundreds upon hundreds, probably thousands, of encounters by the U.S. military with these objects. Very little mitigation seems to be going on there. These objects seem to be able to do exactly what they want. Well, that's Moultrie's statement. I just want to bring back to your attention here this very, very blanket statement. He's saying this back in 2022, but the Arrow report, which just came out a few months ago in 2024, said nearly the same exact thing, almost no difference. And so you can see their attitude is that all of these UAP are essentially TNOs. They are simply temporarily non-attributed objects. And I think that they are able to do this, or they are more able to get away with this kind of language because we've gone from UFO to UAP. This is what I have come to believe. Now, compare Moultrie to this very famous statement in history from Major General John Alexander Samford. Many of you know who this man was. Samford, during the great overflight of UFOs over the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., in July of 1952, this was something that got a tremendous amount of publicity, newspaper attention, headlines, the like, and it was quite significant. By the way, in my about 15 years ago, I was lucky to talk to one of the last surviving air traffic controller who was present there, a man named Howard Coughlin, who was very, very upfront with me about seeing, yes, a craft. He said it was plain as day. But anyway, Samford led a press conference on July 31st, 1952, in the aftermath of this, and he's basically trying to calm the public down. I'm going to read you this whole statement. It's significant, and then we're going to compare it to what Ronald Moultrie said. Samford says, of this great mass of reports, we have been able to adequately explain the great bulk of them. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberration. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we are now attempting to resolve. He goes on and he says, our basic difficulty in dealing with these is not, our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate custom sort of analysis to take the next step. Not many people quote that, but that's exactly what Samford said here. And you really think about the candor of this statement compared with any such statement coming out of the Department of Defense in the last several years. And arguably, I would say Samford is far more open at this moment than any current defense official is. And he goes on, and then, going to the exact line that Moultrie has taken. He says, we have, as of today, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern or purpose or of consistency that we can relate with any conceivable threat to the United States. So he's essentially saying in the end, the same message that Ronald Moultrie gave just a couple of years ago. It's like, we don't know what these things are. We're working on it. We'll get back to you when we figure something out, that whole thing. But we don't believe, we're quite confident this is not a threat. It's nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for you to worry about. So that's Samford. Moultrie's statement is a lot more brazen, in my opinion. It's a lot more arrogant, in my view. But the two of them, these two gentlemen are 70 years apart with the same message, except that the one of today is probably less satisfying than the one 70 years ago. In other words, all of these years, when you think of the 1950s, when I was writing about this years and years ago, the 1950s were the dark ages of the UFO cover-up, really. 1950s, early 60s, it was like the U.S. Air Force had total domination of the public narrative, or at least for the most part it did. News media was mostly compliant with that. The Air Force always made sure that they got their public relations people out there. They had a bunch of them back in those days. They dominated the message. And they also had their people within academia. They had the astronomer, Donald Menzel, who was secretly working, had connections with the NSA. No one knew about that at the time. Yeah, they had a really good situation there. And yet the statements coming out of our military today are actually more heavy-handed and less nuanced, I would argue, than the statements that were coming out 70 years ago. So, we like to think that we're in this era of this great openness relating to UFOs or UAP. We like to think that, things are changing, but in a sense, you could almost say we're graduating almost to the level that we were at in the 1950s. Maybe. Think about this. This is the Chinese balloon or spy balloon, or however they resolved what that thing was. That was in 2023, about a year and a half ago now. And this thing was openly discussed as a UAP. This was openly and seemingly in all seriousness discussed as a UAP. Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, in his statement shortly after that with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and some of the other members of the Senate, they were talking about this as a UAP. And can one imagine such a thing, this balloon being discussed as a UFO, like in all seriousness? I have a very difficult time imagining that really would have happened without people just bursting out laughing. I don't think anyone would have taken that seriously. It's too reminiscent of the old weather balloon as a UFO joke, like that no one ever has taken seriously. So, but here we are, we're back. We're actually now talking about balloons in all seriousness as UAP, as this is part of the mandate, apparently, that the Pentagon believes their UAP study covers. We're going to look at these balloons because these are UAP. Well, again, that's not a very satisfying situation, is it? So let's leave that aside. I'm going to come back to that again. And we will talk about the transition of disclosure to transparency. This is also really quite significant also. As far as I can see, the whole transparency conversation started also to really take root around 2020 as well. You start hearing transparency being discussed. That's Senator Marco Rubio there. And in fact, he was associated with this phrase transparency, as far as I can see, back in 2020, that summer. There was an article in Politico, which I cited here from June 23rd by Brian Bender, where you hear transparency being used. I haven't seen examples of it earlier. They probably are there. I just haven't found them yet. But certainly by 2020, we're starting to hear more talk about transparency as opposed to disclosure. And all right, so you might think, well, what's the big deal? Is it really a difference that matters? And I would say it is. Absolutely it is. For 20, 25 years, the UFO community has had this phrase, this word disclosure, that has been one of the most prominent concepts in the UFO community for the past quarter of a century. Books have been written with that title in it. I wrote a book, I co-authored a book called After Disclosure. I got into the mix myself. Other people have as well. Stephen Greer has a book called Disclosure. The concept of disclosure has been brought up over and over again. Stephen Bassett, UFO activist, talks about disclosure all the time. This is embedded in our culture. And when we hear the phrase disclosure, we know what it means. Disclosure. I mean, disclosure and transparency both advocate for a kind of openness and giving of information, but they're very different. So with disclosure, you're getting this idea of an unveiling of previously hidden or secret information. Disclosure carries a sense of finality and completeness to it. Now, that doesn't mean that disclosure is ever going to be final or complete, but it gives you the idea of an admission. It's an established authority, we tend to think the President of the United States, who comes clean, as it were, with what they actually know about UFOs. That's really what the meaning of it has always been in any practical sense. It suggests a moment of revelation where the truth about UFOs is laid bare for public scrutiny. Transparency is a little different. Transparency really implies a kind of ongoing process. It's kind of like a process. It's like, it's a commitment to openness. We're going to be transparent with you. We're going to be open and accountable. But there's no promise in transparency of any kind of full revelation. That's not implied. So transparency is a term that governments, institutions can adopt very comfortably. It's a form of virtue signaling without any real commitment to the complete exposure of anything that they consider sensitive or potentially unsettling, anything that would cause catastrophic disclosure or anything like that. It's simply the government, the Pentagon in this case, saying, we're going to be transparent with you about our process. And essentially, they're implying, and you will then see that we're not hiding anything at all. We're being completely open. There's no cover-up. That's all conspiracy theory. That really is where this is headed for. So we go from UFO to UAP. We go from disclosure to transparency. We go from UFO disclosure to UAP transparency. And there's a lot of political and social implications in that transition. It's look, a little dance has just been done without people really even being fully aware that this has happened. It's a linguistic shift. On the one hand, when we hear about UAP transparency, it's you hear these politicians talking about transparency, and it seems that they are speaking to a society that is more and more skeptical of the government, and they act as if they're kind of on board with that. It's like, yes, the public deserves transparency on this matter. So all this, a lot of high talk really about this so-called transparency, public right to know, and all of this. Yet paradoxically, when I hear or see this term, it makes me think that it's a gamble that the public will be willing to accept vague assurances of openness, really vague assurances, because it allows for a semblance of accountability while still controlling the narrative and the extent of the information that's released. So I started this by talking a little bit about George Carlin, but here's another George that many of us are fans of, George Orwell. And so in the spirit of George Orwell, let us look at this evolution of language as another case study in the power of language to shape reality, to control thought, and to obscure as much as it reveals. Orwell, of course, wrote the brilliant story Animal Farm, and he wrote the incredible dystopian novel 1984, both of which are remarkable and brilliant. He was a great essayist too, and my personal favorite essay by Orwell will always be Politics and the English Language. Highly recommend it. I'm sure you can find it easily online. It's really worth reading, even though, I mean, Orwell wrote this like roughly 80 years ago almost, and it's every bit as relevant today as when he wrote it. And what he really is talking about, I mean, Orwell was always all about language as a tool for clarity and truth and freedom, as well as a tool for obfuscation and oppression and lies and control. So he talks about in Politics and English Language, he talks about the use of euphemisms and political jargon in the politics of his day that were used to mask all kinds of harsh realities and political actions. He used phrases back then in the 1940s. He pointed out phrases like pacification, which basically meant bombarding villages, or transfer of population, basically meaning forced displacement, as examples of euphemisms and of political jargon used to obfuscate, not to clarify. You got into the whole thing about meaningless words, which is just as relevant today as back then. Terms like democracy, he said, freedom, justice. He says people use these without any kind of precise definitions. You don't know what they're really talking about, except that it's obvious that when politicians use these, they are attempting to exploit popular emotions and without really committing their own agenda or telling people what their own specific actions usually are. But freedom, democracy, I mean, those words are just as abused today as they were back then. He had a lot of other things to say. He talked about the use of the passive voice and pretentious types of diction, and a lot of other phrases like that, which what he really argued is that he said, if you are using power to propagandize and to control others, you are less and less likely to use clear language. You're going to be obligated to use language that is obfuscatory and that is unclear and that is deceptive, essentially, is what that is. And you know, Orwell's basic rule of clear communication is that when you write a sentence, he said, you have to be able to see it in your eyes, in your mind's eye. He talked about the use of, back in his day, the word visage, which was a fancy word for face. He said, why use visage when you can use face? You know, in other words, use language that people can actually relate to, and that when you speak a phrase, people are more likely to be able to actually see it in their mind. That's good when language can do that. It will convey truth. When you feel like someone gives you a long sentence and you can't really figure out what's going on, he says, be suspicious, because something is going on there that in all likelihood is not going to be to your benefit. And by the way, you know, Orwellian language, I mean, we've been dealing with this throughout the entire 21st century. I mean, remember post 9/11, government talked about enhanced interrogation techniques instead of using the word torture, all kinds of collateral damage, referring to civilian deaths in military operations. The whole phrase war on terror is totally Orwellian, justifying invasive surveillance measures for the war on terror, all these, the forever wars that America's been fighting without any kind of clear objectives or endpoints. And also with COVID, whatever you think about that, phrases like, we started with phrases like social distancing and lockdown, which initially were somewhat descriptive, but you see how they were used repeatedly by officials And to the extent that it really obscured the drastic implications of all that enforced isolation, the restrictions on personal freedom. I remember the phrase flattening the curve, got to flatten the curve. That was used to justify all the extended emergency powers, the economic shutdowns, often without any kind of transparent criteria for success or any kind of endpoints, flattening the curve. We're totally, remember how everything was for safety and health, and science became such a loaded term. Follow the science. Perfect way to deflect criticism and shut down debate by saying just follow the science, even when policies were based on extremely uncertain or let's say evolving data. So yeah, I mean, we see the whole thing in our world today. So back to bringing us back to UFO disclosure and UAP transparency. The whole transition of that has left me feeling uneasy about where this process is headed. I'm not saying that there are no members of Congress or people behind the scenes who are actively working here, that there are no other people really pushing to get some genuine form of disclosure on this matter. I think there are such people. But when you consider the entire direction of the modern world, I'm talking the Western world and the non-Western world, the whole world, is really one toward centralized control, one toward greater, not lesser forms of state-directed propaganda. We really must use that word here. Greater surveillance, greater fear-mongering, not lesser fear-mongering, but greater fear-mongering, fear generation. We're in that world. So in that world, it's not hard to imagine how the UFO, well, it's not hard to imagine that the UFO subject will not change anything here. It's easy to imagine that things won't change, or hard to imagine how it will break the trend. Maybe that's the best way I could have put that. Now, it's my sincere hope that it does, and I do think it can. And I have felt for a long time, and I continue to hold out this hope that a true disclosure or a true breakout of information about the depths of the UFO reality can be a very welcome, can lead to a very welcome transformation of our public conversation on many, many things. And the reason is that it will come as a shock. There is no way that a UFO disclosure can't be a shock. I do understand there are folks out there, they want to avoid what they consider to be a catastrophic disclosure. I think some of them are very well-meaning, and I don't look at all of them as the enemy, but I will just suggest that thinking you can avoid a genuine, deep shock to the system with a genuine UFO disclosure, you think you can avoid that, I think that's delusional. I don't think that's going to be possible. The system that has grown around the UFO secret over the last essentially 80 years is so deeply entrenched. It is so broadly illegal, and we can even say probably criminal, has involved so many powerful players at this point, and at this point involves very likely a great amount of money, because technology is money. So all of that, to expose that at this late date is going to be disruptive. There's just no way to get around that. You can try to spread this out over a period of decades. I'm sure that there are people who want exactly to do that. But I'm personally, you may have your own opinion on this, but I'm personally skeptical that it will be easy to stretch this out in such a way that it's a nice, gentle landing. I don't see that. You look at the discussion of UAP transparency today, and what is noteworthy from at least from my point of view is how this vague language still has not gotten the public even slightly closer to the hard, visceral reality of the phenomenon itself. I appreciate the fact that there has been some commentary on alleged or apparent holding of non-human technology within the classified black budget world. And that is certainly very important. This has been a point of contention by UFO researchers literally for about 50 years, since the late 70s, where it's been discussed a lot. And only now is really up for public conversation. And that's essentially following the statement last year by David Grush. Although a couple of statements by Lou Elizondo and even Dr. Eric Davis certainly helped. But yeah, it really only took Grush last year for a public conversation about potential crash retrievals to be like out there. So that's very important. But there's so much more that is just not discussed. The fact is, the UFO phenomenon is global. It involves every type of environment on this planet, and indeed in Earth orbit. It's in our oceans. It directly interacts with people, including a shockingly high number of cases of missing time and sightings of apparent beings. In my current study of over 600 USO cases that I've collected and gone into, and that I will be publishing later this year, about 6% of them involve either a case of missing time for the witness or a sighting of beings operating craft. In fact, I'll just show you this little chart. It's not all that fancy, but you can just see this is some statistic. This is by percentage of some of these UFO cases. So about 15% of them involve the United States military that I found. 4% involve militaries of other nations. And then you see about 4% involve beings that were seen by witnesses, and a little less than that, cases of actual missing time. And only a couple of those cases overlapped. I think I have a total of close to 40 out of the 600 cases in which one or those other things happened. It's quite significant. It's a small minority, but it's not an insignificant number. So there's a definite amount of personal interaction that people are having all the time with this phenomenon. And by the way, as far as USO cases go, I have several that took place in 2024, so they're quite up to date. Now, you can say, regarding cases of missing time or sightings of beings, you can say that you don't believe such claims because I imagine for some of you, they don't have an official government or scientific seal of approval. I do know that there are researchers who feel that way. And unless it came out from FOIA, they don't want to know about it. Or unless it's been officially sanctioned, they don't want to know about it. The information did not come from our authorities. Well, I understand that up to a point. But my question to those skeptics would be, can you not look at the data with your own mind, with your own eyes, and your own ears? Can you not simply use your own mind to think for yourself here and to recognize that the institutional structures that are so intent on being the authoritative sources for everything, that perhaps those institutions have their own agendas? I mean, look around. We are no longer encouraged to think for ourselves. We are all now expected to play a big game of follow the leader, follow the science, follow the state, follow the corporate power. Last thing I guess I'll say here is, you think of language. Language by its nature is, it's artificial, but it's organic in a sense. It's an organic creation of human societies. We people, that is, in all different regions of the world, develop different languages, and those languages themselves evolve and change to meet new social needs. I'm speaking in English, but it's not Shakespeare's English, which was 400 years earlier, because it's a different society, different social structure, different technology, different everything. Language has to change. That's organic transformation of language. But frequently in our world, language doesn't evolve as a bottom-up phenomenon, but it can be imposed in a top-down manner, purely for public manipulation. And this, I think, has definitely happened many, many times with many things in our world, and it has happened with the UFO subject as well. And again, it's not that UAP is always a bad term to describe this. It has its use. There are cases where something is seen and it's not necessarily clearly an object. Is a glowing orange sphere of light an object? Well, maybe there's an object inside there. Maybe there isn't. We don't really know. Is it an object or is it a phenomena? There are examples where it's appropriate. And so one can understand why Dr. Richard Haynes years ago would have thought, let's go with this. And one can understand why genuinely interested students of this phenomenon would want to use it when talking with members of Congress. But we have to make sure that use does not devolve into abuse. And the same goes for the word transparency. The thing is, when you start hearing large numbers of politicians and other establishment types using these words as if on cue, well, maybe it's time for us to pay attention. There's always more to say on this, but I think that's all I'll have for you today. It's always a pleasure. I will be back at this again soon with more analysis, updates, more information about our UFO subject and this upside down world that we find ourselves in. If you like this video, please do like and share it. Do select notifications so that you don't miss any new videos I post. And certainly check out my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where I do this sort of thing very often. Lots of content there to explore. I'm very grateful for you spending this time here with me. I will be back again soon. And until then, let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.